Is there any indication that the followers of Jesus, and maybe even Jesus himself, were actually vegetarians?
That did not eat meat.
Right, they didn't eat
the living
meat.
creature, right. I would go back all the way. The answer is yes, but let me start back. Why not start in Genesis 1, and then we'll move forward. In Genesis 1, ideally humans are given the Genesis diet, Genesis 1:29. Every fruit of a tree, every seed, and so forth, I give you for food. So according to Genesis, and remember, this is whether you take it literally or mythologically, it's the story that Jesus is growing up with. He quotes from Genesis about marriage from the beginning. It has not been so, the two become one, and so forth. He's very familiar with this text. So that was the ideal. Then you fast forward to Genesis 9, and God gives Noah and his children permission to eat meat for the first time. And it's given as an accommodation. You can tell the way it's presented. As I gave you the green herb, I'm now giving you this. And we're not sure why that change was made. Is it editorial? Is it a redactor or whatever? But meat eating comes in. Okay. Now, when Israel's in the wilderness, though, when God gets them back to an isolated thing, these are stories in the Bible, they're back to vegetarianism. They're eating a plant that produces this thing called manna. We think it's like some sticky desert plant, different speculations about it. And they start crying for meat because, you know, the culture is a meat-eating culture. They come from Egypt. And they go, oh, we remember Egypt and we had all this wonderful meat. Can we have meat? And the text presents it as a disappointment. In fact, Moses tells God they're complaining, they want meat. And he says, I'll give them meat, not for a day, not for a week, but a month until it comes out their noses. So this is like not real gentle. It's the idea you want meat, you're going to get meat. I'll tell you a related story about David Koresh, you know, the Branch Davidian guy. I was involved in Waco. I hope we can talk about that someday. But I have a tape where David's giving a Bible study and some woman calls, they're in a home, and Rachel, his wife, answers, hello, and you can hear kind of on the tape, David, so-and-so's on the phone, and she said she got tempted and ate a can of pork and beans, or opened a can and ate some pork and beans. They followed kosher, they didn't eat pork. David says, tell her to eat the whole thing. You know, the idea again would be, hey, you wanted it? Eat it until you're sick of it. It's sort of interesting, just that came to my mind.
Wow.
So anyway, they get pigeons. Pigeons or doves fly over, and there's so many, it just covers the desert floor. And they're so hungry for meat, they don't even let it cook, and they start vomiting and getting sick. Okay, so then you fast forward to Daniel, and he's in captivity, and he's among the Babylonians, and what's called the potbog of the king, the delicacies of the king. You could imagine the cuisine in this story of, Babylon, essentially Nebuchadnezzar's table. And he says, no, we don't eat that stuff. Probably kosher, but he says, give us za'arim. Give us the Genesis seed diet. That's the word seeds. Give us seeds and water. And they're saying, yeah, but you're gonna get all frail and hungry. And of course, in the story, they thrive. So here again, you have Jews in exile trying to do the Genesis thing, right? So it's sort of like a thread running through. And then you go to Jeremiah, and that's really interesting. They find the book of the law, according to the story. You get it in Kings as well as Jeremiah. And if you look at Jeremiah chapter 7, Jeremiah taunts them about the temple. He says, you guys say, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. But then you do all these immoral things, and you offer all these sacrifices. And he says, in the day that this is God speaking, thus says the Lord, Jeremiah quoting, in the day that I led you out of Egypt, I did not command you to offer sacrifices. I only said, obey my voice and follow me, like a relationship. And then Jeremiah says, and this house of prayer, This is Jeremiah quoting God again. This house of prayer, which is called by my name, you have made it a den of thieves. Now, we're going to go to Jesus in a minute, but many of your listeners will go like, Jeremiah said that? I thought that was Jesus. Maybe Tabor's mixed up. Jesus is quoting Jeremiah. Now, if you look at the Hebrew, I brought my Hebrew Bible for effect, and I'm not going to open it, but I've got it here marked if we needed to look at it. And you could put a screenshot up maybe later. If you look at the word thieves, it's essentially a verb, peratz, which means, first of all, it's a den, a cave, like a lair of a wild animal. And it's not thieves. Thieves could be a translation because they rip things and tear things. It's actually, you become a lair of those who shred, who rip apart, who rip the necks of animals, who, cause a lot of blood. I think he's referring to the sacrifices, Jeremiah. Now, why does he say a house of prayer? Because in Isaiah 56, Isaiah had said earlier, my house will be a house of prayer for all people. Universal. Very interesting. Jesus quotes that as well. So he quotes Isaiah 56, Jeremiah 7, puts them together, and we'll get to that in a minute. What was Jesus saying? Now, a house of prayer for all people. So we go to Solomon, and this is where it gets really interesting. In Kings, 2 Kings, or 1 Kings, I believe. Yeah, because David dies, I think it's 1 Kings. Yeah, it is. Chapter 6 or 7, right in there. Solomon dedicates the temple. Now read Solomon's prayer, just the prayer, not the thousands of animals that were offered, which could be a redaction. And he does not say anything about sacrifice. He says, the foreigner will come from a far country. He will stand before God. His prayer will be heard. It's all prayer
2 Kings
of all
6,
nations.
I believe it is. And it's the prayer of Solomon.
Yeah, I thought it was 1 Kings, but you might be right.
It might be 1 Kings
But
6.
it is 6, yeah, because it gives that chronology too. Now, what about Isaiah 56? This is really interesting. If you read Isaiah 56, and I do this with my students, and I should probably just turn to it and show you how this works, because whenever people forge things, and I think this is partly forged, they interpolate. Ancient interpolators are really dumb. Like today, interpolators are really smart. They figure, you can't tell, they figure out how to do it. But you remember the famous statement of Josephus on Jesus. He was a man, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man. Interpolation. I give that to my students and I say, read this, see if you can cross out the things that sound like they were added, and then read it without them. And now we have an Arabic text without the interpolations, and it reads exactly what you would do with the blue pencil if I gave you the text and said, cross out the crazy stuff, like he was the son of God or anything like that, and just make it Jesus, a wise man, a teacher, and so forth. So Isaiah 56, the foreigners who join themselves to the Lord, minister to him, love him. This is like Solomon's prayer. Everyone who keeps the Sabbath, holds fast to my covenant, I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Interpolation. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted. Take that out, and you can see it keeps going. For my house should be called a house of prayer for all people. You see what happened? Somebody read that and they go, okay, house of prayer, I'm okay with that. But I'm going to put between two verses on the house of prayer, which read perfectly well together in Hebrew and in English. Well, they're going to offer sacrifices. So, and that's the only thing about sacrifices in this chapter. So Jeremiah is aware of that. And I know people dispute this, but Jeremiah says the false pen of the scribes has made the Torah a lie. That's one translation. Obviously, people don't like that translation because the Torah cannot be a lie. But what if Jeremiah has a copy of the Torah that is more like this Shapira scroll that I want us to talk about in the future? People can look this up. Bar Magazine, the current winter issue of 2021-22, I've got an article about the Shapiro scroll that people can look up. But what if Jeremiah is right, that originally the Torah did not have the sacrifices, but was more ideal? Then you go to the Messianic chapter, Isaiah 11. This is the Davidic Messiah. Whether it's Jesus or not, doesn't matter. We'll get to Jesus. What is the final thing? The wolf is with the lamb. That could be metaphorical. But then it says, they will not hurt or destroy. Shakat is destroy. You know what that means in Hebrew? That's the slaughterer that kills the animals. They will not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain. Holy mountain is the temple. They're not going to sacrifice. It's also in Isaiah 65. And it's in Isaiah 66. To this man will I look. You know, what are you going to bring to me? All these sacrifices. Now the counter to that, you know, we go Eden ideal, wilderness ideal. This is the ideology of one thread that goes through the Hebrew Bible. Daniel ideal, because he's following God. Messianic age ideal. Prayer of Solomon ideal. But then people have the rivers of blood added. So the counter to that usually is, oh, God loves sacrifices. He just didn't like that they were insincere. They're insincere and wicked when they offer them. If they would clean up their lives, he'd love that blood. But if you read the text in Amos, Hosea, you know, Jesus' favorite scripture, Hosea 6:6, go learn what this means. Like, go learn? I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Now people read that like, I desire sacrifice, but you need to have mercy, you know, love. And then I want it. That isn't what it says. It says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. So, you know, Amos, you know, shall I come with my firstborn son, which is what some versions of Christianity ended up with. You know, like, I'll offer my son as atonement for my sin. He goes, no, no, no. What does the Lord require of you? To walk humbly, do justice, and love mercy. I mean, you get these ringing passages in the prophets. So, it's possible that there are these two strands. There's the priestly strand. We got P, you know, if you go by the sources. And they're all for sacrifices. And it's a big money-making thing, believe me. Any temple. Temples are banks, basically. It's where people offer all these things and the money is flowing in. You can imagine Herod's temple. And Jesus calls him the fox. Go tell that fox. You know, he's not so fond of Herod, who killed, this is Herod Antipas, who killed his cousin John. So then we go to the time of Jesus, and what do we find? We find John the Baptist doesn't eat meat or drink wine or even eat bread. One of the passages in the Q passage says he doesn't eat bread. Now, you know Slavonic Josephus, that's in the back of the lobes, you know. I know it's Russian and it's later and so forth, but they talk about the diet of John that makes sense. Why wouldn't he eat bread? He won't even eat he definitely wouldn't eat the Passover lamb, but he wouldn't even eat like the bread that's baked in any Jewish home every Shabbat and every festival, because it doesn't grow of itself. He wanted to live like manna, like the manna. Now everybody says, well, wait, he ate locusts. That's like meat. I mean, it's a creature. But the Ebionite texts, you know, the Gospel of the Hebrews that Jerome and others preserve for us, Origen quotations, there's a Greek word akris and akris. It's just one letter different. One means locust and the other means honey cake. Very similar to manna. And the Ebionite Gospels, Ebionites are the Jewish followers of Jesus. They reject Paul. They don't accept the virgin birth. They say Jesus is a human being. They say born of Joseph, but either way, human being. And they're vegetarian, and they think sacrifices were never intended. So you actually have a movement coming from James and his followers that is vegetarian and is rejecting the sacrifices. And so you see this sort of idealism coming through. There's also a statement in the Gospel of the Hebrews, which is, you'll hear it called Gospel of the Hebrews, Gospel of the Ebionites. It has various names. But it's sayings that are not in our New Testament. But Slavonic Josephus says that he would only eat things that grow of themselves. Josephus mentions that when he goes into the desert in his Life of Josephus, his little book, he studies with Banus, and he says we only ate roots and plants. So here's a first century witness, Josephus, that said, I became a Pharisee later, so he probably ate meat, but originally I was following the piety of the desert, the spiritual desert. You see, Jesus goes into the desert, fasts. John the Baptist is in the desert. I think the desert is the real key. You go back to the desert. It's pure, it's clean, it's not Babylon, it's not civilization, it's not corruption. And the temple in Jerusalem is a den of shredders. So fast forward to Jesus. What does he say when he, quote, cleanses the temple? He actually stops activity for a whole day. We've talked about that in another interview we did. And he declares what Jeremiah, he actually quotes Jeremiah. This house, which is supposed to be a house of prayer for all people, has become a den of people that shred animals. And then in the Gospel of the Hebrews, there's a saying we don't have, and if it was in the Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, boy, it would cause a stir. Unless you cease sacrificing, the wrath of God will not depart from you. So we got these texts. It's I call it the blue thread that runs through. And I think John the Baptist, James, we clearly in our sources, he does not eat meat or drink wine. So what does Jesus eat? He says the Son of Man came eating and drinking. Everybody translates that eating meat because the King James had meat. But remember, the King James uses meat for bread, right? That's the Old English. Mm-hmm. Like, have you had your meat yet? Meaning, have you eaten yet today? So it doesn't say meat. It says he came neither eating, meaning the common food that people eat, or drinking. But one of the texts, if you look, they're parallels. Whereas John came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, the Son of Man came eating and drinking, meaning eating bread and drinking wine. So he did drink wine, and he ate bread. So he's not living as strict as John. And maybe his brother James is a modified view of that because he doesn't drink the wine. Now, Paul knows about this because in Romans 14, he's writing to the Romans, and he says, I want to talk to you about this diet thing because some of you are convinced that a person should eat only seeds. Calls it vegetables in the translation, but it's basically, some of you are following the Genesis diet. And you're also saying you shouldn't drink wine. James, he's met James, we know that. And others of you are eating meat and drinking wine. He said, just if a person has that view, the ascetic view, fine. God is their master, the Lord is their master. If they don't, fine. Clearly, Paul is on the meat-eating side of things. But Paul's idea is God will judge. And remember, for Paul, all this eating, drinking, even marriage, it's all passing away. So he has no interest in these questions. He just didn't want people divided up. So we probably have a group of John the Baptist kind of influence followers or James influence followers that have made it to Rome because Paul didn't establish that church. And they're vegetarian. So now we come to Jesus. And immediately everybody says, but he ate fish. Well, and he ate the Passover lamb. Are we sure? Bruce Chilton has argued that the original meaning of the Eucharist, not as Paul has it, but the original meaning, and not as Mark has it, because Mark's echoing Paul, this is my body, this is my blood, given for you, and so forth. That the original meaning was, the disciples say, where should we prepare the Passover lamb? And Jesus says, I will not eat Passover. This is my body. This is my blood, meaning the bread and the wine. You see the idea? Mm-hmm. And as he held up the bread and said, this is the body. We don't need to slaughter a lamb. And this is my blood, meaning we don't need to shed blood and put it on a doorpost or something because we drink the wine. And I don't know if Chilton's right. I think it's an interesting theory. People can look it up. He published it in Bible Review. It's online. You can find it. Just interesting. But the question is, if Jesus said, I will no longer eat Passover with you, did he mean he never did, or he had come to that view, maybe under certain influence? I'm not sure. Just an interesting thing. But the fish, as far as him eating fish, it's at the resurrection accounts of Luke and John, and it's to prove that he's not a ghost. And I've written a lot about the resurrection accounts, how they go from no appearances to one appearance with people doubting. That's Matthew. And then you go to Luke, and it gets like, oh, we're going to have lots of appearances, the men from Emmaus and so forth. And he's going to come like a ghost, and he's going to ask to eat. And then John, of course, has appearances in Jerusalem and finally in Galilee in the last chapter, the appendix, where he does eat fish. So are we sure he ate fish, or is that an attempt of Luke and John against opponents like Celsus later, this would be later, saying, well, maybe they just saw a ghost, or maybe they saw an apparition. And you go like, no, we got that covered. Notice the text. He asked for something to eat. He's a physical body. But remember, we did a show on the resurrection body. Mm-hmm. Paul said it's not a physical body. The body he saw, said there's the body of dust, flesh and blood. He says flesh and blood. But he said there's also the life-giving spirit, and that we were the body of flesh, but at the resurrection we're the life-giving spirit. So I think the Luke and John accounts are later, and they're apologetic, and they're trying to say the corpse really got up and walked around, and then he went to heaven and got transformed. Paul does not have that view. He says James saw Jesus and Peter saw Jesus. I see no reason to think that they didn't see the same thing Paul saw, because otherwise it'd be crazy. He goes and meets Peter and James, and they go like, oh yeah, he walked around, he ate fish. He go, what? Like he was a decaying corpse with his wounds and all? That's not I saw a light. I saw a heavenly being that was so glorious I can't even describe it. It's things unutterable, he calls it, the glory that I saw. So anyway, that's another subject. But I think you can make the case. Then the Ebionites, for sure, the Jewish fathers of Jesus, they speak against sacrifice all the time. And they say that's why God destroyed the temple, because God never wanted sacrifice. So back to Jeremiah, in the day I led you out of Egypt, I never commanded you to do sacrifice. But they want to do sacrifice. Why? It's like going to the Greek festival. It's like any kind of jamboree party. It's like Greco-Roman Apollo, on Apollo's birthday, you're going to have barbecues and people dancing and drinking, and this is irresistible to a culture. And so the Baal worshipers and the Canaanite worshipers, they're having great stuff at their temple. What are you supposed to do? Just go in this little tent somewhere and just pray to God? It's not very appealing. You need to have like a huge banquet or something like that. So anyway, I think you can make that case that not eating meat was the original ideal. And Isaiah's the strong one. If they're not going to hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, then... Now, Jesus did say that you've made this a den of thieves. It can also mean traders, T-R-A-D. Zechariah 14. In that day, there will be no trader in the house of the Lord. Now, people say they're trading money. No, they're not trading money. They're trading animals, because you bring your lamb up, and I'm going to find a blemish on its lower left hind leg and go, you didn't notice that? Here, the priest, you're going to have to get one of our lambs. I know they're, we call it today, airport prices. They're going to be pretty high. But hey, this lamb's perfect, certified. You'll have no trouble taking it in, and you can have your Passover. Yeah?
Oh, my
So they're
goodness.
traders. They're trading. And I guarantee you, any animal you brought from the Galilee and you brought your little lamb down, your old, it's like a little puppy dog pet, your old lamb, they're going to go, nah, you can keep it, but we got one you need. And that's what Jesus is objecting to. The commerce. Money changing is just part of it. Like, do you know that they changed their money into Tyrrhenian shekels? It's nothing to do with, I heard in Sunday school all my life, I grew up Christian, oh, they had pagan money and the Jews only used pure Jewish money, so they had to trade and get the pure money. No, they had to trade and get the Tyrannian pagan money because it's 99.99 certified from the mint at Tyre, and that's the only thing they would trust. Because you come from all over the diaspora with your coins and go like, I don't know who minted that? It's a coin from Bithynia or something. We can't take that, but we can trade the good coins. So you got to buy your animals. See. So anyway, I think you can make a case that the original ideal that Jesus reflected, get rid of the traitors, get rid of the den of thieves, get rid of the robbers, the shredders, and go back to the original. Now, one final point. When Jesus upholds no divorce, what does he do? The Pharisees couldn't believe it because Deuteronomy says that divorce is allowed. And they say to Jesus, when he says, if you put away your wife or a wife puts away her husband, that's adultery. And they say, well, Moses allowed it. And he said, because of the hardness of your heart. From the beginning, it has not been so. And then he quotes Genesis. I think he was doing the same thing with the diet. Yes, you are allowed to do it. You're allowed to eat meat because of Noah and the violence that filled the earth. And people are going to do it anyway. I love Aronofsky's film Noah because he actually takes this position that I'm taking, where Noah is appalled. Remember at the bloodshed in the movie, and he talks to his children about it. This is what the nations are doing, shedding blood and being violent. It takes a lot of violence to kill an animal.
And, just one comment on there as we got 2 minutes left. I think it's interesting that violence is what the wickedness of Nineveh is in Jonah. You kind of wonder, am I reading into it too much? But no, I mean, at least we know Nineveh, what they did to Israel. That might be what it's referencing. But the point is the violence that constantly happened from the nations.
So if they in the future will not hurt or destroy on the holy mountain, which is where you worship God, then the ideal is no sacrifice. Go back to the Eden diet. And could I add, I think it's healthier. Plant-based diet is kind of taken over now, at least even people that eat meat. They're being told all the time, base most of your diet on plants. You're going to be much healthier. Many of the chronic diseases could be caused by an unbalanced diet. So even for that reason, which I'm not talking about health today, but these ideas. So I think that blue thread is pretty strong. Trace it on through. I mean, look how it jumps from this. Every time there's a control situation, then you don't eat meat. But when everything is just being done according to the will of anybody, then you can't eat meat. So the will of anybody's desire. But my favorite story is the pigeons. I'll give you meat. Not one day, not a week, but a month till it comes out your noses. And they started loathing the meat and didn't like it. So it's a case. But probably the Ebionites are the best example because they are the Jewish followers of Jesus that survived. They follow James. And then when James dies, Simon is put in, either a cousin or a brother, we're not sure. And he probably also grew up with these same traditions of his brother. So I think Jesus probably respected this. If he's bookended by John and James, why would he be different in the middle?